question of kind of a death spiral of penalties being imposed on them simply because they can't get responses back from the IRS. Number one, have you had a discussion about what the steps should be to begin fixing the issue? And then second of all, will the IRS hold taxpayers that find themselves in this position harmless?
I've met with the IRS commissioner and discussed a range of questions, including IRS's ability to distribute economic impact payments and the child tax credits on a periodic basis. I haven't had a detailed discussion with the IRS commissioner about the issue that you raised, but in general, the IRS needs more funding to be able to work appropriately to put in place the technology it needs to collect taxes. We know that there's a huge tax gap. It's estimated at something like $7.5 trillion over the next decade. And more generally, I think IRS needs funding to be able to appropriately manage the burdens it has, including, providing support to taxpayers who call. A shortage of personnel makes it a frustrating matter to try to call to get advice from over the telephone.
And it's not my point to be argumentative with you, Madam Secretary. I just simply point out that you've now got $1.9 trillion that have been allocated specifically, some of it for pandemic relief. And the IRS suffered too because during the pandemic, they had a very difficult time in getting their folks to be able to work, and that's very understandable. But I do think that it's not unreasonable for us to ask for a plan to try to take care of that backlog. And I would simply ask for your commitment that you would go back and expect them to respond to you and then to us with a plan that's appropriate to get that backlog resolved as quickly as possible.
I'm certainly willing to do that and to work with you in your office and let you know, what the plan is.
Thank you, Madam Chair, or Madam Secretary. Also, and I'll just share with you, as we've just begun to highlight, you have a lot of challenges ahead of you, but one of the biggest tasks that the Treasury will be obligated to complete in the near term, outside of pandemic relief, is the implementation of the Illicit Cash Act. I partnered with Senator Warner on this, and we were able to get it into the National Defense Authorization Act. And so it's there, it's been signed into law. Given everything on your to-do list, and I think I've just added a few more to that, can you lay out a rough game plan for how you would envision implementing the Illicit Cash Act?
FinCEN and Treasury more broadly have been very focused on implementing the provisions of the NDAA. It's a very high priority project for us, and we're already very hard at work and hiring people in order to be able to complete that work in a timely way.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question for the chairman, but I will put it in as a question for the record. I see that my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So after the 2008 financial crisis, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act to put more cops on the beat and prevent Wall Street from wrecking our economy again. One of the protections that Dodd-Frank put in place was to automatically create a special designation for the too big to fail banks. At the time, those with assets of $50 billion or more. So they received stronger oversight by the Federal Reserve. Chair Powell, why did Congress think it was a good idea to put stronger oversight in place for banks above a certain size?
I think it was a wise decision. It was, particularly for the very largest institutions, it was clear at the time that we needed to raise expectations across a very broad range of measures, including particularly capital, liquidity, risk management.
Okay, and we needed better supervision to do that, I take it.
I would agree.
But it isn't just banks that pose a risk to the economy. In 2008, two investment companies, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, failed, triggering the 2008 crash. So when Congress passed Dodd-Frank, they created the Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FSOC, and gave it the power to designate non-bank firms as too big to fail, or in the terms of the statute, to designate them as systemically important, which means they get the same stronger oversight as the too big to fail banks. Is that right, Chair Powell?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so let's look at an example of how that's working today. BlackRock is the world's largest asset management firm, overseeing nearly $9 trillion in assets. That's more than double where it was 10 years ago. It also holds a stake in just about every company listed on the S&P 500. To put that in perspective, BlackRock manages more assets than the entire GDP of Japan, or Germany, or Great Britain, or any other nation in the world except the United States and China. And it's not just size. BlackRock also runs a technology platform that currently houses at least 10% of all the stocks and bonds around the world. So, Secretary Yellen, just hypothetically, if a $9 trillion investment company failed, would that likely have a significant impact on our economy?
Well, Senator Warren, I believe it's important to look very carefully at the risk posed by asset management industry, including BlackRock and other firms. And the FSOC began to do that, I believe, in 2016 and 2017. But the risks it focused on were ones having to do with open-end mutual funds that can experience massive withdrawals and be forced to sell off assets that could create fire sales.
Right.
That is actually a risk that we saw materialize last spring in March. And I think that with respect to asset management, rather than focus on designation of companies, I think it's important to focus on an activity like that and to consider what the appropriate restrictions are. It's not obvious to me that designation is the correct tool to address.
Now, wait just a minute. Designation is what gives the Fed its increased oversight power. Is that correct? Is that correct?
Yes.
And is BlackRock currently designated so that it receives that increased oversight?
It isn't designated, but I think it's important to understand.
So that means it is not receiving the increased oversight from the Fed. So my question is, are you currently looking at designation for companies like BlackRock, $9 trillion companies like this?
Well, as I said, FSOC has looked at this issue in the past.
I understand they've done it in the past. I'm not asking about what the last Secretary of the Treasury did. You are the head of FSOC now. And the question I'm asking is whether or not FSOC is considering and looking at designation for these large financial institutions.
Well, I think it's appropriate to designate institutions whose failure would pose a material risk to U.S. financial stability.
And that's why I started my question with, does potentially a $9 trillion investment company pose some risk to the American economy if it should fail?
Well, one needs to analyze what the risk is. An asset management company is very different than a bank.
How do you analyze what the risk is if you're not actually doing the investigation through FSOC?
Well, FSOC has undertaken such work in the past. And as I said, when it looked at asset managers, it issued a report outlining what it saw as some of the most significant risks from those industries. So I appreciate that they've done this in the past.
Are you continuing that investigation now?
Well, I'm just beginning a work program with FSOC, and certainly risk from asset management will be on the list.
I understand that when the stock market is going up, it is easy to ignore risks that can be building up in the system. That was the mindset of the regulators that led up to the 2008 crash, and that is how taxpayers ended up on the hook for a $700 billion bailout of the giant banks. When the party is going strong, it's the job of the regulators to take away the punch bowl. My view on this is that Congress gave you the tools to monitor these companies for risk, and it is important to use them. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to go a few minutes over with another brief question. Secretary Yellen, I am grateful to you and President Biden for your leadership in enacting the American Rescue Plan. A critical part of this bill is the $350 billion assistance for state and local governments. Some of our hardest hit communities in Massachusetts are smaller cities under 50,000 in population, places like Chelsea and Everett and North Adams. So I want to ask you, excuse me, about how they get help from this bill. Secretary Yellen, in general communities with populations under $50,000 receive some direct federal funding as a result of the American Rescue Plan, but they don't receive as much direct help as bigger cities. Is that correct?
Well, I believe there's a formula that determines how much they receive, and it's paid to them through states. I believe that's
good. That's where I want to go, because direct funding is not the only money coming into state and local government. In addition, state governments also receive a separate pot of money that was flexibly designed to help our hardest hit communities.
Sure.
And specifically, the statute says that state funding can be used to respond to public health emergency with respect to the coronavirus disease or its negative economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits, or aids to impacted communities. Is that correct, Madam Secretary?
Yes, it is correct.
Good. And in Massachusetts, it looks like there will be about $4.5 billion going to the state government. So, Secretary Yellen, just to be clear, this statutory language provides our governor with the flexibility to use state funding to provide extra help to address negative economic impacts in smaller communities that did not qualify for larger pots of direct funding. Is that right?
That is my understanding, but we will put out guidance and work through all of the legalities. But I believe that what you have said is correct. I want to be very careful about the legalities, but I believe that what you said is correct.
Senator's time has expired.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Phillips from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chair Powell, Secretary Yellen, thank you for being here today. Secretary Yellen, I have a quick question. During your confirmation process, you said that a global minimum tax could stop the destructive global race to the bottom on corporate taxation and help discourage harmful profit shifting. You went on to say that it's necessary for U.S. companies to be globally competitive, and that's why the OECD negotiations are so important. But I'm trying to understand, having been a state legislator and Speaker of the House, I'm trying to understand how this is different from federalism and the states trying to be competitive. When I became Speaker of the House, we had the highest corporate tax rate of any state that had a corporate tax rate. Now we have one of the lower ones. We were also in the fourth quartile for economic performance and for corporate job creation. Now we're in the top quartile. So why would any country like a Vietnam or Thailand or any developing nation buy into the idea that they should have a minimum corporate tax rate? Why wouldn't we expect, just as an extension, why wouldn't we expect a flow into those jurisdictions that would have a lower corporate tax rate at the expense of the United States?
Well, we believe that the OECD negotiations can be productive in creating a regime in which there is a minimum corporate tax rate, and that it's a way of stopping destructive race to the bottom in terms of countries competing for business based on their corporate tax rates. And this is something we're committed to working to try to accomplish internationally.
So do you believe that the lowering of the corporate tax rate here in the United States didn't have a material impact on economic expansion in the United States?
I don't think it had a very substantial impact on investment spending in the United States. People are still studying that, but it does, I think it is necessary for U.S. firms to be competitive. President Biden has suggested raising the corporate tax rate back to 28%. We, at this point, collect only a tiny amount of revenue through the corporate tax, less than 1% of GDP. And I believe it is appropriate to raise the tax rate, but we need to worry about the competitiveness of American firms, and doing that in the context of a global agreement.
I've got one other question. So in your opinion, the increase of the corporate tax rate up to 28% will not cause any significant competitive disadvantage for the United States for corporate expansion?
Well, I think it would be important to make sure that it's done in the context of a global agreement.
Okay. Last month, you gave public support for the IMF's proposal to issue a new allocation of special drawing rights. Several proposals have been put forth. I think just yesterday, the IMF announced that they're seeking $650 billion. I believe that there was a House proposal that was looking at $3 trillion. I know proponents of the SDR say that this has no budgetary impact, but I don't think that tells the whole story. Isn't it the case that the U.S. Treasury has to borrow the dollars it gives out to the IMF when the SDR exchange is made?
Yes, it does. If we provide the dollars, that's true. But we also earn interest to the extent that we hold SDR above our allocation.
But if you do the SDR allocations, you're either going to issue T-notes or T-bonds, right? And to finance this, to finance the increase in the SDR obligation. Is that correct?
So I believe that CBO scores this as not having a cost, a net cost.
They say it has no budgetary cost. So is the U.S. really misrepresenting the situation with respect to longer-term taxpayer obligations?
I don't think so, because there will be interests that are earned on the SDRs that offset the payment of interest to issue, say, T-bills. And it's not only the United States that will likely provide hard currency in exchange for SDR. There are other countries that also will take part in that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I'm going to keep to the 5 minutes. Chair Powell, I had a question on asset bubbles and your insights into maybe global asset bubbles, but that's something I'll just submit for the record. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes. You're mute, Chris.
Secretary Yellen.
There you go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, Chairman Brown. I want to thank Secretary Yellen and Chairman Powell for your testimony. Secretary Yellen, I think that the action you took with respect to SDR is in our national interest, and I appreciate you moving forward on that.
Thank you.
I did want to ask you a question about long-term unemployment. I was heartened by your testimony this morning that you hope and anticipate that because of the passage of the American Rescue Plan and other measures that have been taken, that we may get back to full employment by the summer of next year. I remain very concerned about the long-term unemployed. Even before the pandemic hit, we had more than 1 million Americans who were long-term unemployed, meaning they were looking for work for more than 6 months and couldn't find anything. That number is currently 4 million. I do expect that with the natural improvement of the economy, that number will come down. But I also think that if we don't take deliberate measures to help bring the long-term unemployed back into the economy, that we're going to be leaving them behind. I did have a conversation with Chairman Powell about this in our last hearing. He agreed that deliberate, targeted measures were necessary beyond just the natural lift in the economy that we hope we'll see as a result of measures taken. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I am worried about the long-term unemployed and think we should be focusing importantly on what we need to do to make sure that they're not permanently scarred. Yes.
And would you agree, though, that beyond measures we take to, fiscal policies and other policies that we take to improve the economy, that in order to address the needs of the long-term unemployed, we're going to have to be more deliberate and have policies targeted to accomplish that?
We may very well. And I'm not sure, Senator, exactly what you have in mind, but policies that focus on training, workforce development may be appropriate as the economy recovers.
Right, I appreciate that. Well, Senator Wyden and Senator Baldwin and I have proposed different forms of long-term unemployment elimination bills. They do include a workforce training component, but they also include some level of subsidized employment for 1 or 2 years combined with those wraparound services in order to make sure that we address this chronic problem. As you've said before, the longer somebody's out of work, the harder it becomes for them to find work. And when they do get it, they may be stuck with lower wages for the rest of their working life. So we hope to deal with this in the next piece of legislation on infrastructure improvement and other challenges. Let me ask you about the IRS because we've seen chronic underfunding of the IRS since really 2011. And as a result, it's hard for Americans to get their phone calls returned. It's harder for the IRS to process things like payment. Right now, a lot of people are still waiting for their refunds from last year's tax season. In addition to that, the estimate is that as a result of the lack of enforcement ability, about $570 billion in taxes that were owed last year did not get paid. 70% of that coming from the top 1% of Americans. So for all of these reasons, you agree that we need to better resource the IRS, both to improve customer service and to make sure that tax cheats don't get away with not paying their fair share.
I absolutely agree. The tax gap is huge, and I think we'd have a fairer tax system and collect more tax revenue without the need to raise rates if we resource the IRS properly to be able to address this issue.
I look forward to working with you on that. We were able to provide $1 billion as part of the American Rescue Plan, but
yes,
more is needed. And with my other hat, I chair the subcommittee on financial services and general government appropriations, and we're going to be asking for your help as we look at this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Kennedy is recognized from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Chairman Powell, I want to start unusually for me with a statement as opposed to a question. I have been very supportive of you and the Federal Reserve and its independence. That was my position with the Trump administration. It will be my position for what it's worth with the Biden administration. And in fact, I have said both publicly and privately, Mr. Chairman, that the single most important thing that was done to save the world economy, not the American economy alone, the world economy from melting down at the during the shutdown last March, was your decision to implement a foreign currency swap line when the whole world was not looking for treasuries, they were looking for dollars. There's an effort going on worldwide to blur the line between government and politics on the one hand and central banks and their independence on the other. I see every day central banks getting more and more involved in fiscal policy and lobbying legislators with respect to the adoption of fiscal policy. I've noticed that the Bank of England has announced in its QE program that it is going to stop purchasing corporate bonds from companies that it thinks has too big of a carbon footprint. I've noticed recently that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has decided it's going to start in its policy making, its monetary policy, taking account of housing prices. Now, this is where I'm headed, Mr. Chairman. The Federal Reserve needs to maintain its independence in America. Your credibility depends on political independence. I give you Turkey if you don't believe me. And besides that, the Federal Reserve and the good people in it are unelected. They don't have democratic accountability. And my concluding point, and I'm just going to ask you to respond briefly. Some people are going to beat on you, Mr. Chairman, like you stole Christmas, to get involved in social policy and the guise of economic policy. And for the long-term health of the Federal Reserve, you need to resist that.
Thank you, Senator. So I do think Fed independence, and thank you for your strong support on that. I do think that Fed independence is an institutional arrangement that has served the public well over time. And I am strongly committed to continuing it. I also would agree that getting off of our home base and straying from our mandate is something that will put independence at risk over the long term, because we have this precious independence because we have a limited mandate and we stick to it. If we're going to be playing on every issue, then the case for our independence weakens. We should have as little, there should be very few examples of independent agencies that aren't part of the administration.
And you're one of them, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for cutting you off, but I want to stay within my time, and I need to ask Secretary Yellen a question. Secretary Yellen, the Biden administration's plan, and it is your plan, to require the IMF to issue $1 trillion of these SDRs, new SDRs, is going to cost the American taxpayer about $180 billion. Now, your reason for doing that is a good reason. You say you want to help poor countries. But you and I both know that only about 10% of that money is going to go to poor countries. It's not going to help poor countries. It's going to help if they cash in their SDRs. It's going to help China. It's going to help Russia. It's going to help Venezuela. And besides that, under your plan, you're intentionally splitting the plan into two tranches of $500 billion each to avoid having to come before Congress. And I don't understand why it is efficient to charge the American taxpayer $180 billion, all of which we have to borrow, and you say you're doing it to help poor countries, and only 10% is going to poor countries, and even more is going to Russia and to China.
I'm sorry, it's not going to cost the taxpayer $180 billion.
Sure it is. You're going to have to borrow the money. You don't have the money sitting in a checking account.
IMF.
They're going to redeem those SDRs, not just the poor countries, but China.
There are many countries that can provide hard currencies in return for SDRs, including the United States. if the United States does agree to provide SDRs, it will have to issue Treasury bills or debt to do it, but it will also.
I rest my case.
It will,
I rest
no,
my case.
I'm sorry, but it will also earn interest on any amounts that it converts on behalf of other countries, and it will be essentially a wash.
But the money will
So
never be
it will
paid
borrow
back.
and it will pay. It does. There is no money to be paid back.
Sure
It doesn't matter. The interest that we earn on any excess SDR holdings offsets the cost of issuing treasuries, and it's essentially a wash, and it is not costly.
I disagree with you, Madam Secretary. I think no disrespect, but I think you're wrong. I think we're going to have to borrow all $180 billion of this.
I don't know where you got a number like that from.
Well, when China comes to redeem its SDRs and says we want dollars, where do you think we're going to get the money? We're going to borrow it. I've gone over. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but this is an important issue. I'll call you, Madam Secretary.
Okay, I'd be glad to talk about it offline.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, Chairman Powell, welcome back to the committee. Let me start by expressing my appreciation to the staffs at your agency who are charged with implementing the laws that we have passed. I know that the staff at the Internal Revenue Service, Treasury Department, and the Federal Reserve have worked long hours to implement these laws. So let me just say, on behalf of Nevada, on behalf of the American people, I so appreciate the work that your staff have done to deliver financial assistance to Americans. So thank you for that. Let me start, Chairman Powell, with you. It's a conversation we always have around our hospitality and tourism industry, as you know, that's been so hard hit. Can you talk to me about what you're seeing with respect to those economies and the recovery? I think you've said that about 2/3 of the tourism and hospitality jobs lost in March 2020 are back. So can you talk a little bit more what you're seeing as a result of the relief that we have passed here in Congress and the impact it is now having on hospitality and tourism?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So actually, it's just 2/3 of the jobs that were lost during the winter COVID spike came back. The hospitality industry is still down. Travel and hospitality is still down several million jobs, and I'm sure you're seeing that at home. We're beginning to see airline travel. We're beginning to see people going to restaurants and hotels, and all of those things are just beginning to pick up. And all of that, of course, is motivated by declining COVID cases and increasing vaccinations. And, if we can just stick to social distancing and mask wearing, if I can put that commercial in again, it'll enable us really to get this done and get the economy reopened. And all of these small businesses that are hurting so much can get the relief that they need. And it's right there to be done if we can follow through on this in coming months.
I'm curious, do you see any regional variations in jobs returning in this industry?
It's very much unemployment generally is very much concentrated in these states like yours and others that have high tourism and travel and entertainment components. Those are the ones that are suffering. I don't know. As between individual states within that group, I don't know I couldn't say much sitting here today about how much variation there is.
No, thank you. And thank you for your work and always speaking up and out about the need to address the concerns that we see with the hospitality and travel industry that's been so hard hit because of this pandemic. Secretary Yellen, as part of the American Rescue Plan, we also included $10 billion in assistance for homeowners. And so can I ask, what is your timeline for getting frequently asked questions and guidelines out to communities wanting to help homeowners? We talk a lot about rental assistance, but there's still a lot of homeowners in need and help. And that's why we included $10 billion in assistance. So Secretary, can you talk a little bit about that as well?
We're committed to getting this money into the hands of homeowners at risk of foreclosure and falling behind on their payments as soon as possible. We're working hard on it. We're conducting outreach to state housing agencies to understand their needs and to make sure these funds are quickly and effectively distributed to communities in need. We're working hard at it. I can't give you a definite date when we'll get the FAQs out.
Thank you. And so then the same question to you, as you know, we have also talked about this, the hospitality and leisure industry has been so hard hit. The money that we fought for, particularly in this last package, was really to focus on that industry, not only those businesses that are directly involved, but those that are indirectly involved. And I'm looking to you to help us to make sure that the guidelines get out as quickly as possible where they're needed to make sure we get this money into the communities. And I know this is a focus of yours as well, Secretary Yellen.
Yes, I think, the money that was designated by Congress for restaurants and associated industries, that's being managed by the SBA rather than Treasury, but we stand ready to work with them to be helpful.
Yes, and thank you. And I cannot stress enough the money that we fought for, the $350 billion to our states and local governments.
Sure, absolutely.
The same thing. I mean, this is literally life-saving, and that's why I think that the entire Democrats have fought for this and will continue to fight for this. It's the only reason that this is in the bill. And I just can't stress that enough because everybody is struggling, and from those states that are, whether they're Republican or Democrat states, whatever you want to call them, states are struggling, and it's in a bipartisan way. And so that's why this was so important.
That help is going to get out very rapidly. We have a maximum of 60 days to work through all of the thorny questions. We're working very hard on it, and we're going to get that money into the hands of state and local governments to use to support their communities.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for what you're doing.
Cortez Masto. Senator Kramer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary and Chairman Powell for being here. First of all, I want to associate myself with the comments of Senator Kennedy, specifically about the importance of the independence, Mr. Chairman. I know you and I have talked about this in the past, and it's just really critical. And I applaud you for your discipline in that. What I wanted to talk about today a little bit is that the banking agencies, of course, are starting to roll back last year's regulatory measures that responded to pandemic stresses. And as you know, we made some provided some temporary relief. And we're hearing now that community banks are under leverage ratio stress because of the influx of deposits, which, of course, they're holding largely at very low risk in very low risk assets, and of course, somewhat because of their strong commitment to the PPP lending. So as the banks continue to work with their customers and communities, I'm just wondering what factors will you consider in deciding how to address leverage ratio pressures, and how much lead time will the banks and their customers get to adapt to these ad hoc decisions? And I can start with either one of you can start. Maybe start with you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. So on the community bank leverage ratio, that's something we'll be watching carefully, and we'll communicate it well ahead of time. And we're well aware of those stresses.
Very good. Well, thanks. Well, Secretary Yellen, then I'm going to ask you another question, and if you want to address the CBLR as well, that'd be great. But you've made, of course, addressing climate change one of the central points of your time at Treasury. It's been reported that President Biden's climate czar, John Kerry, has encouraged banks and other investment institutions to form a net zero banking alliance. He's also urged banks to provide as much support for alternative energy projects as possible, which seems to be at the expense of more traditional energy projects, and possibly even forcing financial institutions to put political and social considerations ahead of sound business practices. And that would, of course, be a violation of their fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders. So in light of this weak unemployment numbers, do you think it's a good idea for private businesses to be forced by a government official or even encouraged by one to make decisions about where they should or should not put their money, jeopardizing jobs in our energy and other sectors of the economy that are, legal commerce, represent legal commerce and industries and businesses?
Well, Senator, I think the world faces a profound crisis in connection with climate, and it is appropriate for government, the private sector as well, to focus on how we can mitigate the risks, to encourage banks and financial institutions, lenders more generally, to think about the potential adverse impacts of investments that they may make, and perhaps more importantly, to understand that eventually we are committed to going to net zero emissions by 2050, and that can affect the returns that they receive on investments. I don't think that's inappropriate, but there are no requirements by government that I'm aware of to force anyone to lend for any particular project, or not to lend to businesses that are involved in carbon emitting activities.
Well, there certainly are some very strong suggestions that border on pressure at the very least. And of course, a lot of these bigger banks are responding to that pressure and to market forces as well. But that said, I might just bring up a scenario in, say, a cold place like North Dakota or anywhere in the Midwest for that matter. When we get to times where there's a very like a polar vortex, as some people like to call it, we just call it winter. Or for that matter, you get a peak hot summer stretch when the baseload electricity that people used to rely on to keep their companies running, their manufacturing facilities going, or the gas that used to be the feedstock for a manufacturer becomes fuel for generating electricity. That could have a pretty negative impact on the companies, the manufacturers, the server farms, who suddenly find themselves with rolling blackouts. So I just hope that we can take a whole approach to these things and not try to pick entire categories of industries that, as we talk about, particularly as we talk about fair access to banking.
Well, I agree. This is a process that will unfold over time, gradually, and we need to take account of those impacts.
Thank you for your consideration. Again, thanks to both of you for being here and for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. We just call it winter. Thanks for making me laugh. I noticed she laughed and I laughed. Moran didn't get it, so he didn't laugh. But Senator Smith is recognized from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Senator Smith definitely got the joke about that's just winter. So thank you, Senator Kramer. I appreciate it. And I think I'm going to start with Secretary Yellen. It's great to be with both of you, Chair Powell and Secretary Yellen. Thank you again, Secretary Yellen, for another display of grace under pressure as you were getting talked over a minute ago. I appreciated that very much. And speaking of which, I want to just hone in on the issue of women in the workplace. And, you and I have spoken about this, the challenges that women are facing in the workplace right now. COVID has made it so much worse. Women dropping out of the workforce at roughly the same rates as men, but now what's happening is men are returning to the workforce and women are not. In Minnesota, it's a 11% decline in women's participation in the workforce. And one of the there's two basic issues that women face. One is lack of access to affordable childcare, and the other is lack of access to paid family leave. And this is happening in the United States in different ways than it's happening in Europe, as I understand it. So as part of the American Rescue Plan, as you well know, I worked with Senator Warren and others to make a significant investment in shoring up our childcare system.
Yes.
And, Secretary Yellen, I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about this. How does this ability of women to participate in the workforce connect to our economic competitiveness, and what role does childcare play in making sure that women can participate in the workforce and support their families?
Well, I think that women have contributed enormously in the United States and in countries around the world. Their labor force participation has boosted growth and has boosted household incomes. And we saw a surge in women's labor force participation in the 1970s and 80s, but it's leveled off and it's even declined somewhat. And there are a number of reasons for it. But when you look at the fact that in many European countries and other developed countries, labor force participation of women is now higher than it is in the United States, what stands out is paid leave and affordable childcare as two things that distinguish the United States from those countries. They're really critical to enabling women to successfully participate. And I think it's exciting that the American Rescue Plan really addresses these issues, providing additional, very meaningful support on both fronts.
Yeah, thank you. I think what we do in the American Rescue Plan, not only with providing, with shoring up our childcare system, but also the child tax credit, which is going to have the impact of lifting, reducing child poverty by half, shows us the policy levers that we have to make our economy work for women. And ultimately that contributes to our economic competitiveness, as you say.
Yes, and it also helps children, I think, in the long run succeed to have that additional support.
Absolutely. It addresses that opportunity gap, as I like to talk about it, rather than an achievement gap, because it's really a lack of access to opportunity that our children have if they are living in poverty. This brings me to another thing, Secretary Yellen, I want to talk with you about. It's something that you and I have also talked about. Data shows us that people experiencing homelessness have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. And you and I have spoken about what we can do to get the recovery checks, the stimulus checks to people who are experiencing homelessness, and there's particular challenges getting the checks to them. Yes. Recently, your staff provided my office with a briefing on what Treasury is doing to connect with local shelters and providers and continuums of care to get checks to people. And I was really heartened by hearing what you are doing. And I want to make sure that these community-based efforts continue. So we just have a couple seconds, but I was wondering if you could just maybe just talk about that for a minute. And then if you could commit to providing some sort of guidance or publishing best practices, because I think there's some great examples of what works around the country.
Great. I mean, I think publishing best practices, trying to figure out what they are, is a very important role that Treasury can play in this and in other programs that we're charged with implementing. One of the most difficult issues is getting impact payments, and it will also apply to the child tax credit, getting these payments to homeless individuals. And as you say, we are working very, very hard, and happy to work with you to try to do everything we can on that front. We're working with IRS on this as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Moran from Kansas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Chairman Powell, thank you for joining us. Secretary Yellen, pleasure to be with you again. Look forward to being in the circumstance in which it can be different than virtual. Thank you both for your public service. My question will be directed to you, Madam Secretary. The American Rescue Plan included $350 billion for state and local fiscal recovery fund. To be used for emergency funding to distribute to states, counties, local units of government. I know that the department is currently developing guidance in this regard. I'd be interested in knowing the time of that guidance, but I want to highlight for you a circumstance that Kansans and many other states, particularly in the middle of the country, are experiencing. No relief can be for COVID can be taken without looking at its broader consequences. And I'll take us back to what the chairman was talking about, winter. A few weeks ago, we had this tremendous cold snap that invaded the country, north to south, from Canada to Texas. And that cold snap created huge increases in utility bills, for consumers and even for businesses. It's estimated in Kansas someplace nearly $100 million in utility increases because of 3 days of temperature below zero and the cost of natural gas. In other words, the purchase price that utility companies were encountering to purchase enough gas to keep homes warm, to keep businesses operating was so high that the utility bills now reflect that $100 million increase that was experienced over just a few days. A few examples for you, Madam Secretary. There's a Kansas municipality. Some of our communities generate their own electricity and then sell it to their citizens. But one of those cities in Kansas with a population of less than 300 people had a February gas bill 3/5 of the total amount of their annual city budget. Another city, just over 1,000 people with household incomes less than $30,000, had a February energy bill over $9 million. A school which typically has a $10,000 a month gas bill in the month of February, it was $400,000. A small greenhouse in rural Kansas received a gas bill of just under $100,000, of course, crippling that business with an unexpected expense. And my question to you is, I would love to have a commitment that you would work with me and others. I think there's other senators on the banking committee and certainly other senators who have experienced the same circumstance. And I would like to see our state and city, our local units of government have the flexibility under the belief that you cannot take the financial condition of COVID in just a vacuum. All the things that pile on when a business is already so fragile, or when utility bills, individuals and families are already struggling to pay their utility bills, we can't take that just in isolation. And Secretary Yellen, I would just ask two things. Want to make sure you're aware of the circumstance, tremendous damage to small businesses and consumers in Kansas and elsewhere. Ask if you also would see that flexibility makes sense to you, on a commitment that you'd work with me to make sure that we can convince you and that you have an understanding of the circumstance, and then an idea of the time frame in which that relief the guidance might be in place so that relief could be used.
Well, Senator, first of all, let me say I appreciate your describing to me the problems that your state and others face because of the cold weather and the impact on utilities.
Hold the vote. Should we just go?
Second, I promise that we'll work with you and our staff can be in contact with yours to discuss the needs that your state has to deal with this problem. There is a good deal of flexibility within the law on how the funds can be used. Over the next 60 days, the statute provides 60 days for payments to get out, and we need within those 60 days to clarify what the funds can be used for and can't be used for, and glad to confer with you about whether or not this is within the realm of what the statute has in mind. So why don't we have our staffs talk offline about this?
Secretary, thank you for your answer. And you and I make a great team. We ended this in just Sherrod Brown's 5 minutes exactly. Thank you for that today and your response. I appreciate your willingness to cooperate and your understanding of the tremendous challenge and burden that individuals are having at home. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Daines, have you voted already?
I have, yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to call on you, then I'm going to go vote.
Okay.
And I apologize to the chair and to the secretary. We're going to take this up because there are 2 or 3 more people that want to. So I'm going to go vote, call on you, then we'll recess after your question until about 12:30.
Okay.
So if Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell could stay a little bit longer. So Senator Daines will go for 5 minutes now. We will just recess after your 5 minutes, and then we'll come back about 12:30 for 2 or 3 other senators. Thank you all.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Well, let me start off by saying I want to express my utter shock at the provision that was buried within the recent $1.9 trillion package that prohibits states from directly or indirectly cutting taxes. This provision was snuck into the bill at the very end of a more than 24-hour period of continuous voting. Process aside, this astonishing level of meddling by Congress in state fiscal affairs should be troubling to anyone, a Republican, Democrat, Independent, who believes fundamentally in the concept of federalism. This is why I was very pleased to see your response last night to the letter from 21 attorney generals who expressed concern about this provision, including my own attorney general in Montana, General Knudsen, confirming that states can, in fact, still cut their taxes. And to quote from your response, nothing in the act prevents states from enacting a broad variety of tax cuts. That is, the act does not deny states the ability to cut taxes in any manner whatsoever. It simply provides that funding received under the act may not be used to offset a reduction in net tax revenue resulting from certain changes in state law, end quote. I know that Senator Crapo mentioned earlier in this hearing a specific hypothetical scenario involving unemployment insurance trust funds, and you stated the Treasury is still working through some of these issues, and you have 60 days to issue guidance.
That's
right. Great. Thank you.
That's exactly right.
Great. Well, let me just to clarify to you, our legislature in Montana, it meets every 2 years. They're meeting right now, and they're slated to adjourn on or about May 1st. Sometimes it bleeds over a couple of days into May. So they really need this guidance as quickly as possible, as they're kind of now in the final throes of this this biennial session. Secretary Yellen, then would you commit to issuing guidance well in advance of the 60-day statutory deadline?
I can't commit to that. There are a host of complex questions that have to be resolved, and we need to confer with state and local governments, with members of Congress, and work out thorny legal issues around this. We're working as rapidly as we possibly can to get this guidance out, but I don't want to make a commitment that we can get it out a lot sooner than that. We will get it out just as soon as we possibly can. We want this money to be in the hands of state and local governments, but we'll just do the best we can.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Yeah, I appreciate it. Just with what's at stake right now with legislators that are meeting on more of a periodic basis. Shifting over here to Chairman Powell, some have proposed that the Federal Reserve change its operating model to include holding retail and commercial deposits through Fed accounts opened on their behalf by banks with over $10 billion in deposits. Where adequate coverage through banks is not achieved, post offices would open accounts for retail and commercial customers with the deposits held at the Fed. These accounts would be offered at no cost to consumer and retail customers. My question, Chairman Powell, is the Federal Reserve equipped to service individual retail and commercial accounts?
No, and of course we're not permitted under current law, and that's never been our role, and it's really not been the role of other major central banks. It would be a quite dramatic change in our role in the economy, and one that I think should require very careful thought.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer, Chairman Powell. In 2019, the Fed, the OCC, and FDIC took steps mandated by Congress to tailor banks' prudential regulation. We were a year into the COVID-19 crisis, and banks and other lending institutions have been a critical source of relief, have maintained strong capital and liquidity reserves. I think it's crucial we continue to recognize that a bank's size and business model are very relevant to consider when looking at how much risk it poses. My question, Chairman Powell, is do you agree that the tailoring of regulations, including capital and liquidity requirements, to the systemic footprint of a particular banking institution is still appropriate, and that there has not been any demonstrated negative impact to the U.S. economy because of tailoring?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, thank you. I'm out of time. I appreciate the answers of both Secretary Yellen and Chairman Powell. Appreciate it. And I guess, do I need to recess the committee?
Yes, so we are going to be in recess until about 12:30. If Secretary Yellen and Chairman Powell can please remain on the call, feel free to mute yourself and turn off your video until we're ready to come back, or however you feel comfortable.
Okay, so we're in recess until 12:30. Thank you.
Just to be clear, you need us to keep sitting here until 12:30, or can we come back at 12:30 or 12:25?
You can come back.
All right, just making sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. We have been listening to day 2 of the Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen testifying on Capitol Hill, this time before the Senate Banking Committee. Of course, yesterday was the House. There at the very end, I think somebody made a very wise decision when the chair said, do you want us to sit here for the next 20 minutes and wait for you, or can we stand up and move around a little bit? And they said, oh, you can get up. Sort of a wise decision, I think. Joining us now to go over some of what we heard today is our colleague Mike McKee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So it's great in the time of Zoom, isn't it, Mike, to watch this happen?
I was just thinking that that exchange summed up this past year perfectly right. With the Fed chair. Actually, Jay Powell has sort of been a sideline during most of this meeting. The questions to him at the beginning were about inflation and growth. He said, growth is good. We are seeing more people come into the labor force, which is why the unemployment rate is not dropping quickly, but that's a good thing because people are coming back to look for work. And he said that, as he has said in many fora recently, that inflation is going to rise, but it's going to be temporary. Most of the members of the committee have focused most of the interesting questions to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Elizabeth Warren, who has a great interest in banking regulation, pushed her on whether or not BlackRock should be regulated the same way as the big banks, designated a significant international financial institution. And Janet Yellen said not necessarily, because BlackRock is not a bank. You can't do a run on BlackRock in the same way you can on bank deposits. But she said the committee that looks at risks, the FSOC that she now chairs, is keeping an eye on BlackRock and other money managers, and they are doing a survey to decide what the best kind of regulation is. That was one of the more contentious exchanges. Another one was on climate change, when senators, various senators basically asked Janet Yellen why the U.S. government should get involved in forcing private companies like banks to not lend to fossil fuel companies. She said that's not happening. It's important for banks to understand risks, but nobody's telling them who to lend to. And Jay Powell said the Fed's staying out of this. We're going to stay in our lane, but we want them to be regulated. Most interesting exchange and the most heated exchange is the one between the Louisiana Senator John Kennedy and Janet Yellen. I've never seen her lose her cool, but she sort of did today when the subject of special drawing rights for the IMF came up. The U.S. is pushing for additional SDR allocations at the IMF to give to poor countries that are in financial trouble because of the COVID pandemic. And the Republicans have raised concerns about whether or not that would go to fund loans, repayments to China for its Belt and Road Initiative, things like that. And Senator Kennedy asked her if the U.S. taxpayer wouldn't lose $180 billion on it. And she said no. He started talking over her, and she said, just a minute, Senator. And she said, there is no cost to the U.S. taxpayer. In fact, we probably will make money because we earn interest on it. He said he disagreed. But before it got too heated, they agreed to take it offline, and they will speak after the hearing.
Yeah, I must say, Michael, I never thought I would say good television in a sentence with SDRs and Janet Yellen, but that was as close as you get to good television. It was pretty dramatic there for a moment. Very testing. So once again, we are watching this testimony in the Senate. We will be coming back to it at 12:30 after the recess. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Michael McKee for that recap of what we've seen so far. Coming up, Democratic Congressman of California, John Garamendi. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Bloomberg First.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The European Union is tightening rules for expanding the coronavirus vaccine. The bloc will demand that countries that receive doses from the EU also allow shots to be sent back. It will also consider a nation's vaccination rate and pandemic situation when deciding whether to green light shipments. The EU is trying to turn around its sluggish inoculation campaign as governments from Berlin to Paris battle a rise in infections. Some widely available hand sanitizers that American consumers snapped up last year to ward off coronavirus infection contain high levels of a chemical known to cause cancer. Valisure, an online pharmacy that tests products for quality and consistency, found some contain high levels of benzene. The World Health Organization says that's as dangerous as asbestos. Among the most contaminated hand cleaners were products from Art Naturals, sensational soaps and candles, the Cream Shop, and a Baby Yoda-themed bottle from Best Brands Consumer Products. The blockage that has disrupted traffic through one of the world's busiest shipping routes may be closer to resolution. A giant ship that ran aground in the Suez Canal has now been moved to the bank of the waterway. Once it is moved to, or towed rather, to a different position, dozens of vessels caught in a logjam could be allowed to sail through the canal. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, one of the subjects covered in the Senate Finance Committee hearing was the prospect of yet another spending package, this one for infrastructure, and how we might pay for it. We welcome now Democratic Congressman from California, John Garamendi, who sits on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us here during this recess in the hearings. You do have jurisdiction over infrastructure. What do you know about the plan that's likely to come from the White House?
Well, about 3 weeks ago, 8 members of our Transportation Infrastructure Committee, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, met with President Biden and Vice President Harris to discuss his concept of an infrastructure package. And very quickly, it was everything we need to do, and we need to do it aware of climate change and find ways to pay for it. He was very, very clear. He wants a bipartisan bill. He wants to cover everything from streets and roads and trains and planes and waterways, as well as the communication infrastructure and the electricity infrastructure. So we're going to go big. We have a hearing tomorrow in the Transportation Infrastructure Committee to review the president's proposal. We'll know a little more there at that time. But we really need to do this. We need to build an infrastructure for the next century. We built one a century ago for the intervening 100 years, but now we know we're not where we have to be. Also included in that is what I would call education and research infrastructure.
So, Congressman, there have been reports about maybe $3 trillion being the price tag. Does that sound like too much to you? Do you think we need that much?
I think you go at it backwards. If you start at the top without understanding what the elements and the cost of the elements within the package are, it's really foolishness. So let's take it piece by piece. How much money do we need to build a modern broadband system servicing both urban and rural areas of America? How much money do we need to deal with our electric grid? We might start at Texas, talk about that. The green technologies, how much money do we need for each and every one of these? And then you add that up, you come to a conclusion. Maybe it's 1, 2, 3 trillion, maybe it's somewhere in between. We don't know until we take each individual, determine what we actually need to do, how long will it take, how much do we need to spend year by year.
And as you suggested, how do we pay for it? We heard from Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, saying it was okay to borrow money for the emergency of the pandemic, but when we come to longer-term investment, is what she said, we really have to think about raising revenue. What kind of revenue raise are we thinking about?
Well, most of these projects are actually projects for which there is a fee. Consider for a moment water, sanitation. Those are projects that are for which consumers, all of us, pay a fee. Similarly, the highway system, we pay a fee, the excise tax on gasoline and diesel. So many of these, it seems to me, we could do long-term financing using the fee to repay. If we can borrow money at the federal level for 1-2%, it would make an enormous sense to me to borrow that money, associate a fee structure with it to pay back to the federal treasury, and quite possibly can make a small arbitrage on that deal. But the reality is we have to do this. And these are long-term investments, most of them, not all, but most of these are long-term investments for which there can be and often is already in place a fee to pay for that particular project.
Congressman, you quite correctly say to me, let's talk about the substance first, talk about the price tag later, and then later than that, how we pay for it. Makes perfect sense. At the same time, you can't put together the package without thinking about what you're going to need to get it enacted. And let me raise two questions with you. One is the filibuster, whether you're going to need 60 votes or 50 votes over on the Senate side, the other side of Capitol Hill, but also earmarks, and whether those are going to be essential to getting something this massive done.
I think those are all pieces of the puzzle. I'll go back to that meeting in the Oval Office with the president. 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. The Republicans were actually talking about fees that they thought could be used to pay for infrastructure. So there is, at least in the House of Representatives, a strong desire to be bipartisan. Now, the Senate is clearly a different place. I don't need to explain that to the world, but it is clearly a different place. I don't know how it's going to work out, but we do know that traditionally infrastructure is a bipartisan issue. Do earmarks help? Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. No doubt about it. Somebody is going to want to have their own project in their own district. And yeah, you can have that project, but let's consider the entire nation as we consider your project. That will play out, and I think it's useful.
And is that an important part of the step toward some bipartisan support? When we had the American Rescue Plan, it was straight down party lines. I have certainly talked to Republicans who, in principle, say we do need something significant on infrastructure. Are you more hopeful that we'll get Republicans on the next go-around?
Yes. Is it essential? No. If the Republicans want to go back to their voters and say, I didn't vote for the American Rescue Plan to put $1,400 in your pocket, I didn't vote to put shots in your arms, I didn't vote to reopen schools, and I didn't vote to repair your road, your water system, your airport, good luck to them. So I think there's a very powerful political reason for each and every one of us to address the needs of this nation. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, these are critical issues. The rescue package certainly was and is today. And the infrastructure is similarly, we're talking down home. All politics are local. And all of us have to go back to our constituents and explain, why did I vote for the rescue package? Why did I vote for this infrastructure bill? Or on the side of our recalcitrant senators, why they opposed it? They're going to have to explain that.
Yeah, you can never go wrong quoting Tip O'Neill. I think he's the one, isn't he, that said all politics are local? Exactly. That's a noble tradition there. Thank you so much. Really great to have you with us today. That's Congressman John Garamendi. He's a Democrat of California. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.
New projects means
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We are in the middle of a recess in that Senate Finance Committee hearing with Janet Yellen and with Jay Powell. We're going to come back and pick that up when they come out of recess. But in the meantime, we have the European close with our colleague Guy Johnson over in London. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Men over.
All right. I'm glad you guys joined us. Pete, thank you. Jenny, thanks as well. We'll see you back on the desk soon. I know that. If we turn back to the committee, Weiss, you own Taiwan Semi, you own Micron, you own Qualcomm and Qorvo and Skyworks, but you don't own Intel.
I don't. And, I looked at Intel and I've been very clear. Here's the reality. He's very well respected, regarded as brilliant. I don't dispute any of that. It's going to be 3 years at least, probably 4 years, before the fab is up and running. In the meantime, Taiwan Semi continues to entrench their position. It's not that easy to change when you're using one outsourced fab to another. And the fact that he's saying, and he used more buzzwords than I think I've heard in my entire lifetime, just a CNBC interview before, it's not that easy to get customers to change, as I said. And the fact that customers are calling him means that, okay, they want to get better pricing from TSM. So the margins that TSM sees are not the margins that Intel is going to see, because now you'll have this duopoly in the U.S. So in any event, the road ahead is not that easy. We see IBM, and I'm not comparing him to the new CEO at IBM, because I think he's a lot better. But as I look at also what VMware did during his tenure, the stock tracked, frankly, the NASDAQ, except for the last 2 years when it vastly underperformed the NASDAQ. So it's a very, very heavy lift, and you're in the very early stages where that hasn't even started yet. So I wouldn't sell everything and buy Intel here, but I'd buy it on a pullback.
Speaking of selling some things, Joe, you sold, if I recall correctly, the SMH the other day, or at least within the last handful of days.
So I sold the SMH, and I entered a position in Lam Research, which is benefiting significantly from the Intel news of last evening. Real quickly on Intel, I disagree. I think this is brilliant. I think this has nothing to do with profitability. Gross margins are going to decline. You're going to see a decline in free cash flow generation. This is about seizing an opportunity, seizing the moment. This is about America first. This is about if you have customers who are also your competition and you're trying to get them to pivot towards using you, you're going to bring the supply chain security into the conversation. That's why Satya Nadella is sitting alongside him last night, because I think universally everyone agrees this is where we're embracing the supply chain security. And I think it's brilliant on the part of Mr. Gensler that he's gone forward and he's been the first to step out and do this.
All right. I'm going to leave it there. Kate Moore, thank you, as always, for being with us. We'll talk to you again soon. That's BlackRock's Kate Moore with us today. Up next, we have a bullish call on the banks. The committee's trades are straight ahead on that. And a reminder, you can always watch or listen to us live on the go on the CNBC app. We're back on the Half in 2 minutes.
You saw the Intel story out overnight. It is looking for supremacy. It's building fabrication plants. ASML will be providing some of the kit. It is a lithography maker. Lithography, basically, it provides the kit you use to make chips. ASML benefiting from that story, big upside, up by 4.4%. Ryanair by 4.8% today. This is Europe's largest low-cost carrier. It is expecting 80% of a normal summer traffic to be coming back. Some are saying that looks a little bit optimistic. Now, the airline stocks have been very volatile this week, down yesterday, so part of this is a bounce back, but an optimistic outlook, David, from Michael O'Leary.
Okay, thank you so much for that report on the European close from Guy Johnson over in London. Well, we're in the middle of a short recess in the Senate Finance Committee hearings involving Secretary Janet Yellen and Chair Jay Powell. We will go back to that as soon as they resume. In the meantime, let's check in with Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So, Mike, we talked a little bit before about what we've heard so far. I want to go back to one other issue that was raised, and that is the debt and the deficit, and when we should be concerned about that. As I understood it, Secretary Yellen said it's a question of whether it really raises interest rates, but the long-term trend on that is downward, not up.
Yeah, she defended the idea that with interest rates low, we can afford to spend more than we otherwise might, not putting any kind of number on where you would run into trouble. She also addressed the long-held idea that the government could borrow so much it crowds out private sector investment. She said that can be true, but it's not necessarily a bad thing because the private sector can invest in things, as they did during the tech bubble of the 1990s, that don't produce value for the economy. So you have to look at what the money's being spent on, not just who's spending it.
She also suggested, as I heard it at least, that we may not need to borrow as much as you think, because she said it was fine to borrow it when it was an emergency, which is the pandemic, which she would say is the American Rescue Plan, but not so much when it's long-term investment. There you have to raise revenues. Is she really showing already the need for tax increases?
Oh, she's admitting it. She's saying
Welcome back.
taxes
I'm
are
Rahel
going to
Solomon,
go
and here's
up
your
if the Biden plans are adopted. She said that at this point, it is important that companies pay more money. She was asked in a sort of roundabout way by a Republican senator if the corporate tax cut wasn't valuable to American businesses. And she said valuable maybe to their earnings, but they didn't really invest much of that, and it didn't do a lot for the economy. So it won't hurt the economy for them to pay a little bit more money. But she said it should be done in the context of a global treaty on minimum taxes for corporations. Everybody should pay something so that companies don't go country shopping in order to get the lowest possible tax rate.
Well, that struck me, Mike, I must say, because I knew that there was discussions going on in the OECD about coordinating corporate taxes, and I think a lot of economists think that makes good sense. But if we're going to have to wait for that to get done before they raise the tax rate for corporations in the United States, I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon.
I don't think they would wait. They're going to put forward, well, I'm speaking for the administration, but according to the reporting that Bloomberg has done, they're going to put forward a package, and it will include an increase in the corporate tax rate. It will also include an interest in the personal tax rate for those who make the most money in the U.S., and it will also extend the child care tax credit, which made it into the rescue plan, but only for a year. So there will be some additional taxes placed on the economy if the Biden plan gets through, even if they haven't reached agreement with the rest of the world yet.
For our TV and radio audiences, we are waiting now for the hearings to resume before the Senate Finance Committee. They are in recess right now because they had to go take a vote, and we're talking with my colleague Mike McKee. As always happens in these hearings, they go somewhat far afield, going to other subjects that weren't specifically the subject of the hearing. And one of them was interesting to me, which is climate and the extent to which the regulators are going to take into account, and this is both for the Federal Reserve, what I heard, as well as the Treasury, take into account climate considerations as they regulate some of the big banks. It seemed that people said there's a real risk there. We're not sure we can quantify it.
Well, it was interesting because Jay Powell and Janet Yellen agreed on one big thing, but then she went a little bit further. The idea that climate change is a risk to financial investments was agreed to by both of them. Powell suggesting that banks need to be very aware of the risks of climate change and the things that they invest in, like housing along the coast and things like that. And so the Fed wants to know more about it.
Thank you so much, my colleague Mike McKee. We're going to go back now to that Senate Finance Committee because out of the corner of my eye, I can see Sherrod Brown. He is the chair of the Finance Committee, or they're about to resume.
message about fiscal support and American Rescue Plan and what we need to do. It's clearly the right move for the economy. Getting money into people's pockets is good for workers and their families. So thank you all and the committee. You know what? I'm sorry. One more thing. If senators who submit questions for the record, they have to be in Wednesday the 31st. And Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell, based on a change we made to our committee rules, you have 45 days to respond to any questions if there are any. So thank you. And the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Both very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
All right.
Good to be with you. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This is what happens up on Capitol Hill. I believe that this hearing is now just ended. We were told by the chair, Sherrod Brown, before they had the recess, they'd have a recess until 12:30 to be able to do some votes. And then he had 2 or 3 senators who wanted to ask some more questions. But then they came back in and basically said, that's it. We're going to wrap it up. We can write some questions to you and send them along the way. And so that concludes the second of 2 days of testimony by Fed Chair Jay Powell, Fed Chair Jay Powell and Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen. So, Mike, back with you sooner than I thought we might be back with you. But let me go into something else that you raised earlier that I certainly found entertaining, if I can use that word, which was the exchange between Senator Kennedy and Secretary Yellen over SDR, special drawing rights, which, as I understand it, is this form of IMF reserves. And there's a proposal from Kristalina Georgieva, who's the head of the IMF, to increase it by $650 billion. I didn't think it was going to be that controversial, but boy, there was a lot of heat up there on Capitol Hill.
Absolutely. Republicans think that the SDR allocation that the administration is supporting would go towards paying back debt to countries we don't like, such as Iran and China in particular with its Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of countries owe China a lot of money. And the idea of this SDR allocation is that it would help countries pay for their pandemic response. But money being fungible, Republicans are concerned about where it might go. An SDR is sort of like scrip. You get a credit in your account at the IMF, and if you need the money, you can turn that into whatever currency in the SDR basket you want. The U.S. dollar, obviously, the biggest part of it. They could draw on euros or they could draw on yen, things like that. But the guess is they would most people would probably want dollars. And so Senator Kennedy was asking if the taxpayer wouldn't lose money on this. In other words, we would be funding these SDRs and giving people money, and they would be sending it to the Chinese. He picked the number $180 billion. Janet Yellen said, I have no idea where you get that number from. And we wouldn't lose money because we get interest on these SDR deposits, and so that would offset any losses. So the senator started talking over her, and she pushed back and said, wait a minute, I don't believe you. And they got into a little bit of a shouting match.
Yeah, I must say, I hadn't seen that side of Janet Yellen, but it's clear you don't want to cross her in the wrong circumstance. This is not the only time it came up. It came up yesterday on the House side as well, SDR. And let me put you on the spot, and I do this, Mike, only because you know Washington so well. You've covered it for so many years, including the Treasury. Do they need permission from Congress? Because I heard Janet Yellen at one point say, we will come back and consult with you before it. It wasn't clear to me whether they need permission from Congress or whether they can do it on their own.
I would give you the answer, it depends. I think in this case they do because the amount of money they're talking about, it's an appropriated amount by Congress. So in that sense, yes, they need congressional permission, but I don't know how much has been appropriated and not used. It is likely, though, that they will have to go back to Congress. And Janet Yellen said, we will work with Congress on this.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It was quite an exchange. People should watch it if they didn't see it the first time. Thanks so much to Michael McKee. He is Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. Coming up, part of my conversation with Mark Mobius of Mobius Capital Partners about what went on in Turkey and in emerging markets this week. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Well, it's really a reminder, isn't it?
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Earlier this week, President Erdogan of Turkey shocked markets by replacing the head of his central bank, which sent the lira and Turkish equities sharply down. Earlier today, we talked with the Dean of Emerging Market Investing. He is Mark Mobius, founder of Mobius Capital Partners, and asked him whether what happened was specific to Turkey or had broader implications for EM investing overall.
In all these emerging markets, everybody's focused on the currency. I mean, the first question I get whenever I talk about emerging markets, clients say, what about the currency? Is there a risk in the currency? So, and of course, the central banks are supposed to be responsible for a steady currency and a currency that's not volatile. And so whenever you see a central bank a leader being replaced, that creates a panic, despite the fact that if you notice the statement about the new central bank, the governor in Turkey, his objective will be to have a stable lira, Turkish lira. So I think it's probably the reaction was overdone. I think it did not make sense to have that kind of reaction. But it was expected that whenever you have this kind of change, the currency will get weaker. But I don't think the lira will continue at this weakness. I think it will be steady going forward.
Mark, as you say, when we talk about investing in emerging markets, we immediately think about currency. We get nervous about can we really protect it or not. So you are the leader in history of emerging market investors. How do you protect yourself as an investor against currency fluctuations?
Well, what we do is we try to look at purchasing power parity as one measure and other measures of whether we think the currency will get stronger or weaker. And then if we see that the currency is going to get weaker or is getting weaker, we then make a choice of stocks which will benefit from this weakness. So in some ways, a weak currency can actually help us to perform better. So for example, in Turkey, we have one investment in a software company that exports its products. So they're getting foreign exchange coming in, and of course their costs are in Turkish lira, which is getting weaker. So that's the kind of thing we take into consideration. So we try to emphasize that currency can be your helper instead of your detractor.
Mark, one of the big subjects in the United States, but I think it also applies in emerging markets, is the so-called reflation trade. Is it coming? Is it here? Has it already had its time? For example, oil prices actually started to come down over the last week or two, although they spiked up briefly with that Suez issue. What do you make of the reflation trade? As an EM investor, is this the time to go in for the countries and the stocks that will benefit from the reflation or not?
Well, first of all, I believe that looking at what the Fed is doing, we're not going to see a big spike in the inflation indices that we measure, CPI. As you know, I'm not a great believer in those statistics. But anyway, you're not going to see a big spike in those numbers. And of course, the emerging market countries, in fact, the world, Europe included, looks at the U.S. and concludes that, hey, inflation in America is not going anywhere. Therefore, we're not going to get hit with that same kind of situation. So the expectation is, first of all, inflation will, as measured by the CPI, will not raise its ugly head, number one. Number two, the US dollar will get weaker because of the big spending program that the Biden administration has. And of course, we're already seeing emerging market currencies getting stronger against the US dollar. There's been recently a little spike in the US dollar index, getting a little stronger, but basically, the US dollar index is at a weak point and probably will get weaker going forward, which again is very good for emerging markets.
As you look at emerging markets as investments, do you divide it up between the investments that are really tied to commodities as opposed to those tied to IT investment and communications? Because typically people talk about North Asia, for example, as being much more oriented toward communications, IT, but some other places like Mexico, like Brazil, being more tied to commodities.
That's a very important question because we have investments in Brazil and South Africa and so forth, but we haven't been in the commodity area at all for a number of reasons. One, of course, is the environmental problem. You know, you have these environmental challenges. Nevertheless, commodity prices have moved up very dramatically and very nicely, but we decided that we're going to focus on technology and not only the software, but also the hardware. We're looking at things like computer ICs, the software that goes into semiconductors, that sort of thing, the nuts and bolts, because this explosion in technology and the internet is going to be with us for quite some time. Of course, it's been accelerated during the COVID crisis, but going forward, we're going to see a continuing demand for these goods and services.
That was part of my discussion with Mark Mobius, Mobius Capital Partners founder and co-founder. Let's get now to First Word News, and for that we turn to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Some widely available hand sanitizers that American consumers snapped up last year to ward off coronavirus infection contain high levels of a chemical known to cause cancer. Valisure, an online pharmacy that tests products for quality and consistency, found some contain high levels of benzene. The World Health Organization says that's as dangerous as asbestos. Among the most contaminated hand cleaners were products from Art Naturals, Sensational Soaps and Candles, and Cream Shop, and a Baby Yoda-themed bottle from Best Brands Consumer Products. The Biden administration won't demand that its allies make a choice between the United States and China. Speaking at NATO headquarters in Brussels today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S., quote, will rely on innovation and not on tantrums. Blinken was speaking today to some of his colleagues in Europe. Blinken is using that strategy to reverse the Trump-era approach in which the U.S. demanded that other countries boost spending immediately and choose between the U.S. and China. Turkey's president is coming under criticism for holding his party's Congress inside a packed sports complex amid a new surge of COVID-19 cases. Recep Erdogan spoke for nearly 2 hours as thousands filled the stands of the 10,000-plus capacity complex in Ankara, despite the government's social distancing rules. Wearing masks in public spaces is mandatory in Turkey, but videos of the event show many people without masks. In Israel, a deeply divided country has failed to resolve a political impasse in the fourth election in 2 years. Neither Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu nor his opponents have a clear path to forming a coalition government. If no one is able to build a parliamentary majority, there could be another election. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. Up next, chip maker comeback. We're going to take a look at Intel as our stock of the hour. It's trying to return to its former glory as a chip maker. It's our stock of the hour. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Hiring is challenging.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Europe's largest discount carrier is getting ready for the return of air travel in Europe by summer. Ryanair CEO Michael O'Leary expects to be flying at 80% of pre-COVID capacity as they get into the September window. Guy Johnson spoke to Bloomberg earlier today. He spoke to Guy Johnson earlier today about how vaccinations will affect travel.
Frankly, I think people are going to rebel. They're not going to be willing to be locked up. The kids are not going to stay home from school. Life will return to normal, and I think COVID will become, it will still be with us, but it will be much more, I think, similar to the annual flu, the annual cold, because of the success of vaccinations.
Well, Michael, as you know, they might rebel, but right now it's illegal to go on holiday. So until that's lifted, we've got a problem. So my question to you would be, how hard are you lobbying on the vaccine passport issue, and how close are we to a breakthrough?
Well, as you know, John, it's illegal to drive over the speed limit, but lots of people do it too.
So, Michael, let me jump in. Are you telling me that your summer is reliant upon people rebelling and getting on the plane and breaking the law?
No, I was going to move on to say, certainly long-haul travel will be much more restricted. But you have free movement of people within the European Union and in large measure between the UK and Europe as well.
You were talking about the idea on a call a little earlier on that you're going to be flying 80% of the schedule that you would normally fly, kind of July to September. What's your degree of confidence in that number?
There's a reasonably high degree of confidence at this point in time that short-haul flying will significantly recover, I think, through the peak summer months of July, August and September. That's driven by the success of the vaccine programme in the UK. 50% of the UK population, has now been vaccinated. By the end of May, that will be at 80%. Europe will catch up, I think, over that period of time. We think 50% of the UK adult population will be vaccinated by the end of May. They say 70% by the end of June. And then I think you will see a pretty rapid recovery of short-haul holiday travel between the UK and the European Union through the summer. Already the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Greek and the Cypriot governments have said they're going to welcome vaccinated UK travellers from the 17th of May onwards. So, it's not certain, but I think there's a reasonable grounds for optimism that once the school holidays arrive, June, July, August, that we will see, I think, quite significant recovery of short-haul travel within Europe. You won't see long-haul recover this summer. But again, a lot of people who would normally have gone long-haul for their holidays to the States or to Asia will holiday at home in Europe, and we think Ryanair will be the beneficiary of that.
That was Guy Johnson and Jonathan Farrow interviewing Ryanair CEO Michael O'Leary earlier today. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to Yellen about the supply chains and microchips. We're also going to talk with the man who at UMass Amherst runs the program that CDC funds to predict the future of influenza. He's concerned that, in fact, the number of cases in hospital are going up. We may be in way of a third wave or a fourth wave here in the United States. That does it for Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
2 months free.
I'm Mark Crumpton with Bloomberg's First Word News. Some widely available hand sanitizers that American consumers snapped up last year to ward off coronavirus infection contain high levels of a chemical known to cause cancer. Valisure, an online pharmacy that tests products for quality and consistency, found some contain high levels of benzene. The World Health Organization says that's as dangerous as asbestos. Among the most contaminated hand cleaners were products from Art Naturals, Sensational Soaps and Candles, The Cream Shop, and a Baby Yoda-themed bottle from Best Brands Consumer Products. The Biden administration won't demand that its allies make a choice between the United States and China. Speaking at NATO headquarters in Brussels today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S. will continue, quote, to rely on innovation, not ultimatums. The speech was part of a visit with NATO, European Union, and Belgian leaders that Blinken is using to reverse the Trump-era approach in which the U.S. demanded that other countries boost spending immediately and choose between the U.S. and China. Turkey's president is coming under criticism for holding his party's Congress inside a packed sports complex amid a new surge of COVID-19 cases. Recep Erdogan spoke for nearly 2 hours as thousands filled the stands of the 10,000-plus capacity complex in Ankara, despite the government's social distancing rules. Wearing masks in public spaces is mandatory in Turkey, but videos of the event show many people without masks. In Israel, a deeply divided country has failed to resolve a political impasse in its fourth election in 2 years. Neither Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu nor his opponents have a clear path to forming a coalition government. If no one is able to build a parliamentary majority, there could be another election. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
It is 1 p.m. in New York, 6 p.m. in Berlin, and 1 a.m. in Hong Kong. I'm Matt Miller. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets. Here are the top stories we're following from around the world. Fed Chair Jay Powell and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen just wrapped up their testimony to the Senate Banking Committee. We dig into their comments surrounding inflation, jobs, and support for the recovery. Plus, you will hear from Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger on his plan to spend billions on reviving manufacturing in the U.S. Some Wall Street analysts are wary of that strategy. And we'll talk to one of the foremost experts on infrastructure. Sadek Wahba, the former World Bank economist, joins us to talk about President Biden's multi-trillion-dollar economic plan centered around building and boosting infrastructure. Let's take a quick shot, a snapshot first of the markets. I put the Dow and the NASDAQ on here. John Farrow would not be happy with me. I left the S&P off, but it's just not moving as much as the other two. So the old economy is up 0.8%, adding 260 points right now. The NASDAQ 100 is down 0.8%. So real divergence, I think, in the market illustrated there. You can see the 10-year not doing much at 164, but crude up 6%, making up yesterday's drop and then some as that tanker stuck in the Suez continues to hold up oil shipments. Now, joining us for reaction to the Fed Chair and Treasury Secretary's testimony in front of the Senate is Diane Swank, Grant Thornton Chief Economist, and Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. Diane, I'll start with you. What did you get new from the two today?
Well, I think the clear issue is on nuance. What we really heard from the Fed chair in particular was how slow he expects participation in the labor force to come back, how that will hold down. Unemployment rate will not fall as rapidly, they expect, as the economy ramps up. So that sort of good news on a booming economy, a much stronger economy, is consistent in their view with a slow decline in the unemployment rate because it will take a while to pull all these workers in from the side sidelines. And I think it's really important to put his comments into the context of other members of the Fed in recent weeks, and that is how much they are looking at the prime age employment to population ratio. They really are looking at differences across race and gender in that prime age employment to population ratio. We've seen a lot of people fall out of the labor force. He wants to bring them back in. And there is a lot of concern within the Fed about how rapid the recovery in employment will be, even as the economy ramps up.
All right, we are just getting headlines across from the 5-year auction as well. Michael McKee, we've been watching these auctions a lot more closely since the near disaster we saw in 7 years last month. What are you seeing here?
Well, tune in tomorrow for another 7 years, Matt, but this was a 5-year going out today, and it looks like a reasonably good auction. When you look at the statistics that suggest participation, the bid to cover ratio 2.36. The last auction was 2.24. So more people getting in on this action, and indirect bidders were at 58.1% of the 5-year notes, and that tells you that there is participation from overseas. One of the issues with that 7-year note auction was that it looks like Japanese investors did not participate there in March. Their fiscal year closes at the end of March, and there was a feeling they were repatriating rather than investing overseas. So this looks like we've managed to pull out a decent auction here. The 61 billion of 5-year notes go at 85 basis points. The when issued yield 8.47. So all in all, a fairly good auction.
Diane, yesterday we heard from Powell that he threw the kitchen sink at the Treasuries market. Last month there was a question about liquidity in this gigantic, I think, $21 trillion market, just not being there when investors need it. Do you have any concerns?
About liquidity at the moment, no. I think we're in a good position, but that can happen, that can change overnight. And as Mike mentioned, there was already some question about the 7-year auction earlier this month. I think one of the issues that the Fed really has a hard time with is they've got two issues. One is, they're willing to look through a flare in inflation that's based on technicalities. Prices decelerated a year ago, so year-on-year measures of inflation in the next couple of months are going to go up. They don't want to raise rates on that and stop a booming economy from coming back. That's not where they're at. The larger issue is, what about a more systemic flare in inflation? Because we have supply chain bottlenecks. We've got, it's much easier to cut capacity, to turn off and shut the lights out on a hotel than it is to ramp it up. And one of the things we're seeing is that there is very little hiring going on in anticipation of a boom this summer, even though most people expect a boom. Frankly, the leisure and hospitality sector has been hit so hard, they don't want to get ahead of it, but that could put some prices up. And the Fed has also said, hey, we'll look through that as well. What they're more worried about is getting a more inclusive recovery out there. And that is something that's a paradigm shift for the bond market. They're looking to overshoot their 2% target on inflation by a bit. It's not clear how much they can do that and how precise they can be. I mean, these are pretty blunt tools. And for the Federal Reserve to accept a reflation, that may be good for the overall economy, but not good for the bond market. And that's where you get things tricky. A doubling of rates today on the 10-year even is still low historically, but that's a big change in terms of what it costs on that debt. And that's where I think the Fed has to be mindful in terms of how they tread going forward.
Of course, the Fed doesn't really have to answer to anyone except for, price stability and employment. Meanwhile, Janet Yellen has, I think, a more difficult job. She's got really a more nuanced role to play in these testimonies, doesn't she, Mike?
Yeah, she's moved from the Fed over to Treasury across town in Washington, D.C., and moved from the neutral seat to the political seat. And Republicans had a lot of questions for her today. There were some really interesting exchanges. The one that's going to get all the attention on the news is the exchange she had with Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, who criticized the administration for supporting an increase in SDR allocations at the IMF that could be used by poor countries to pay for their pandemic response. Because money is fungible, the Republicans are concerned that that money would go to Russia to pay for oil, it would go to China to pay back loans for their Belt and Road Initiative, all kinds of foreign policy results that the United States doesn't want. Yellen defended the idea, and he started talking over her. And she said, wait a minute, I don't know where you're getting your numbers from. These are wrong. And they did agree to talk off camera, so we'll see what results from that. But it was perhaps the most, I suppose, vehement exchange I've ever seen Janet Yellen have with anybody. The other big issues on the deficit, she was asked if there is a limit to how much the U.S. can borrow, and she said yes, but we're not there yet because interest rates are so low. And she said that right now it looks like the U.S. can continue to expand and needs to expand what it's doing, and it won't really be a problem of crowding out investment. The old idea that if the government spends too much, it crowds out private investment. And she said, hey, sometimes private investment isn't so good. Go back to the tech bubble of the 1990s, and it wasn't clear that private industry did any better than the government in allocating its resources. And then finally, she was asked about taxes, and she said that we did not see a big increase in investment from the corporate tax cuts under the Trump administration. Companies did not follow through, so they could stand to have their taxes increased, although she said it should be done as part of a global treaty to set a global minimum tax so companies don't go country shopping for the lowest tax rate. But it does, there were a couple of economic sort of beliefs, long-held beliefs that she attacked there, and I'd like to ask Diane what she thinks about the idea that you can continue to spend money and that you won't necessarily crowd out the private sector because the private sector doesn't always invest correctly, and that we didn't see a lot of investment by companies from the tax cuts, and they can stand to lose, to pay some more.
Well, we didn't lose a lot of investment. We didn't get a lot of investment out of the tax cuts. That is true. I think what's really interesting is both Yellen and Powell have a history of being deficit hawks, and so do I. And all of us have shifted our views to be much more nuanced. And, you know, spending the last couple of days at the NABE Policy Conference, one of the things that really comes out is it doesn't just matter how much you spend as a share of GDP. These old ideologies, I mean, the pandemic itself was like a meteor that hit the earth and knocked it off its axis, and the old rules of gravity in terms of the deficit don't apply at this moment in time. But I think what's also interesting is it matters what you spend on, and that really came through in our meetings, and that's something you're seeing echoed in both Powell's talk about how the money was spent early on and the need for the money early on, his pleas where he actually crossed a line into fiscal policy before Yellen came on the scene, and her response about the need for infrastructure. I think that has really shifted quite a bit from where we were, and frankly, if you've ever told me that we'd have these kinds of deficits and these low interest rates, I would have not believed it. But this is where we are, and it does matter what you spend it on. I think I'll quote Catherine Mann. I think yesterday she said, well, you don't want to spend it on ice cream and bonbons because then you just get a sugar high and you crash. But it does matter what you spend on, and I think that more nuanced debate is really hard for people to get off of on their ideologies. And let's face it, with Yellen, I mean, this isn't her first time dealing with senators pushing back on inflation. They were expecting inflation back when she was Fed chair, and angry with her for not raising interest rates, which was the last thing she did before she was no longer Fed chair.
Diane, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. Great to see you, Diane Swank there, Grant Thornton, and Michael McKee, as always. Thanks for joining us to talk a little bit about what's going on with the Fed, with the Treasury in Washington. Coming up, Intel's ambitious bid to regain its manufacturing lead and build a couple new foundries. We'll hear from the CEO, Pat Gelsinger, next on the company's decision to spend $20 billion. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger has unveiled plans for a manufacturing investment design that could cost $20 billion. A couple of new foundries will come out of that. Bloomberg's Emily Chang spoke a few moments ago with the CEO.
Because I'm committed to the best products in every category that we participate in, the best cost structure, and the most resilient supply chain. And we see this ability to leverage the industry, but also become a major supplier of foundry to the industry. This is a winning formula, and the world is demanding more semiconductors than ever before. We were getting more digital, and then COVID happened, right? And it's accelerated. So we need to step into this in a big way, and I think our strategy is uniquely positioned for Intel to be able to execute on.
Now, investors loved hearing you say Intel's fixed all its problems. But, Pat, you've been back at the company for just over a month, and we're talking about production deadlines that were missed over years. What makes you so sure that you've diagnosed and solved the manufacturing problems?
We're moving to a yearly cadence of process innovations following that. So we're on track to not only fix the issue, but be at parity, and then parity plus, and ultimately, we believe, sustained leadership into the future. So the path we're on, looked at the data quite extensively over the last month or so, and came to the conclusion, yeah, the team got it figured out. We're back. And as you've seen more broadly with our new Intel IDM 2.0 strategy, as I've declared, Intel is back.
Indeed. Now, you suggested companies like Apple and Qualcomm could be your customers. Why would they be your customers if they are your competitors? Why should a fierce rival also work with you?
Well, as you well know, Emily, and I think you've even written on the subject about co-opetition. And clearly this idea that, in some domains you might compete, in other domains you might be competitors, customers and partners as well. And for that, there's very few companies that can step into advanced semiconductor technology, something that we've only used for our internal needs at scale before. But now we're saying we're going to open our fab doors wide for the industry. And with that in mind, customers are looking and saying, I only have TSMC, Samsung, and Intel as the leading choices, and only one of those is on Western US and European soil at scale. Wow, I need a more balanced supply chain. I want to have at least two suppliers of my advanced technology choices. And Intel is saying we're going to be that. But there might be some skepticism because we've somewhat half-heartedly tried some of this in the past. And we're saying we are boldly going down this path. We're going to have our best technologies, our unique 3D packaging technologies, and I'm going to be making all of my intellectual property available, including my x86 cores for these customers. So we're really going at it with the best that Intel has to offer. And the world needs more semiconductors. The world needs a more balanced supply chain. We're one of the few companies that can step in to do that.
What are the financial implications of the move? You're obviously raising your capital spend by $6 billion. When does this all start paying off?
Well, it is a capital-intensive cycle. Takes a couple of years to build fabs, so you invest well before you have that foundry capability up and running at scale. That said, we are seeing extraordinary demand signals from the industry for today's products. So part of this is I get to flexibly build capacity that meets my products as well as foundry needs. And we expect that we'll run a factory network that has some optimized for our products, some optimized for foundry, and some flex fabs in between, because we need to be at scale across the business. But we do think it takes a couple of years to build this out, as designs take time to be committed to a new process and then test and ramping in manufacturing. But we're underway. We already have some existing foundry customers at small scale that will start ramping up more rapidly. So this business will get underway. We've estimated the overall foundry market at $100 billion by 2025, and we're going to earnestly pursue a meaningful portion of that.
And that was Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger with Bloomberg's Emily Chang on, I think, one of the most interesting stories of the day, especially considering that we're in this chip shortage, right? And you've got supply chain issues that executives are trying to fix. You can watch the full interview with Emily Chang and the CEO of Intel on Bloomberg Technology tonight. Still ahead, President Biden's big bet on infrastructure. The former CEO of Morgan Stanley Infrastructure, Sadek Waba, joins us next to discuss the multi-trillion-dollar package. This is Bloomberg.
funds who are keen to invest in infrastructure. These are long-run assets, steady cash flows, so that makes sense for them to do that. We should create infrastructure IRA accounts, the same way we did 529 savings for college. We should do the same thing. You have 50 million IRA holders. If everyone put $10,000, you have $500 billion that could be deployed to infrastructure over a long period of time. And then you create an infra bank, an infrastructure bank that would be a public institution run as a private institution that effectively can lend and invest in infrastructure for states and municipalities.
What do you think in terms of optimism that this will get done right, Sadek?
You always have to be optimistic. I think there is great momentum. The Biden administration with the Build Back Better is doing exactly the right thing. Hopefully it will pass through Congress. It will be supported by both parties, as long as we're able to find mechanisms that ensures that we can make these investments in infrastructure in a sustainable fashion. We need to make these investments in infrastructure green. They need to be helping the climate. And that, I think, is an important element too. And it's going to cost money. But if we do it over several period of years, I think that will be a huge plus.
All right, we're running against the clock here, Sadek, but I hope I can get you back on very soon to talk more about this. Sadek Wahba is the founder of I Squared Capital, formerly at the World Bank. This is Bloomberg.